Hello and welcome to the CX Files for 12th of January 2023. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan in Montreal. Mark, great to be back with you this week. And we've got a very interesting guest and a very interesting topic, I have to say, considering all the travel pandemonium that went on over the Christmas break, at least in North America. We're going to be discussing the role of customer experience management in the airline industry. And our guest this week is Stephanie Todd, who is based in Minneapolis, obviously a very big travel hub in North America. And she is the founder and the principal at Soul CX.
That's interesting because just yesterday I was reading a white paper that Teleperformance produced on travel, and I think they spoke to about 3,000 consumers in different countries. And of course, it's all about the recovery of the travel industry. We've seen so much chaos over COVID, but then it seems that we've actually seen more and more chaos on the way out to the other side. So I know that you had your own experiences over the holiday season, didn't you?
Well, this is it. And this is why it was, I think, for me, a very close to the bone topic in the case of travel and the role of customer experience management in the airline industry, especially. I was traveling to Western Canada to visit my dad and my brother over the Christmas break, and not only did I experience a number of delays, I had my luggage lost, which ended up causing some inconvenience. Now, this is nothing compared to what we were seeing with customers of, say, Southwest or customers within Canada who were badly impacted by the snowstorm. I was hearing horror stories at Pearson Airport in Toronto, as well as stories out of Vancouver with people literally being stuck in the terminals for 2 or 3 days at a time, getting absolutely nowhere, finding out what they needed to in terms of rejigging their travel plans. Mark, you might remember Mark Trimble, who was a guest on our podcast several months ago. I caught up with Mark live in Saskatoon, and he told me that with his family vacation in Hawaii, his wife and their kids flew back from Hawaii, got to Calgary, found out from the airline they were traveling with, they had no idea what was happening with their flights to Saskatoon. And after a few hours, they just gave up, rented a car, and drove 6.5 hours back because they said it was better than sitting around the airport for several more hours or potentially even several more days.
And I mean, on the flip side, I have noticed on LinkedIn recently some people who've been on the pod before, like Alex Mead, Jonas Berggren from Transcom, talking about their own holiday experiences where they've noticed airlines being much more communicative. You know, where there are delays, they've pushed messages, they've reorganized flights and stuff. So it's clear that some of the airlines are trying, and where they do this, they're getting complimented. You know, we're seeing people in the CX community actually saying, look at this, you know, my flight was delayed, but the airline told me and they automatically put me on another flight. So, you know, where you can actually make a big difference is through this kind of communication.
And this is what Stephanie was bringing up in her interview with me that we conducted a couple of days ago. We shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Number one, as you were alluding to, there have been significant growing pains or strain with the airlines coming out of the pandemic. And her comment to me was, A, we have to be patient. And B, we have to understand that in many cases, there is a human on the other end, whether it's at the check-in desk or on the telephone or during a digital interaction. And please be patient. They're doing the best that they can. Second of all, they're only as good as what they're equipped with in terms of information systems. And this is a big issue that the airline industry needs to address in terms of updating the different solutions and the different software packages they have. But overall, I think what Stephanie brings to the table in this discussion from a CX perspective is consumers have to plan accordingly. They've got to be patient in terms of making certain that they understand the implications of what air travel is going to be like for the foreseeable future. And I think as well, we talked about the issue about loyalty and the fact that the airline industry is driven around loyalty. People want to stick with one airline because they might have a points plan with it, or it happens to be a hub for a particular airline. And just recognize that this strain is going to last for a while, and that making sure that travelers are best prepared is going to be probably the best defense to make sure that the experience is as pleasant as possible.
All right, well, there's a lot going on, but why don't we go straight to the interview that you did with Stephanie Todd at Soul CX?
Great stuff. The CX Files kicks off the 2023 season with a very important topic, one that is, I think, certainly on the tips of the tongues of most people in our industry, and certainly from a consumer's perspective, literally hundreds of millions across North America, as well as other parts of the world. And that is the state of customer experience management in the airline sector. Now, I couldn't think of a better person to have on to discuss this than Stephanie Todd, who is the founder and the CEO of Soul CX. And Steph, something that a lot of people might not know is that while you're based in Minneapolis, I'm based in Montreal, we both literally grew up across the border from each other, you in North Dakota, myself in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, absolutely. We were considered Southern Canadians up in North Dakota, whether or not you would have us.
Well, we were Northern Americans, and I used to love my time coming down to North Dakota to do some cross-border shopping in Minot, as well as to visit some of the drinking establishments down there. It was a lot of fun. But we really are delighted that you could join us today to talk a little bit about what's going on with customer experience in the airline space, especially after some of the debacles that were very widely reported over the course of the past few weeks. You know, I think that when we kicked off the Thanksgiving season, the big issue everyone was talking about was Frontier deciding it was going to ditch the voice contact centers and go strictly digital. But what's interesting was that really wasn't a factor when we got to the Christmas period. And if you take a look at the news media and what was covered, especially in the US and Canada, it was just nightmare after nightmare from a consumer perspective. And I don't know if you were traveling over the course of the Christmas break. I did. I went back to see family in Saskatoon. And while I didn't have the easiest of times, especially when it came to lost luggage, mine was just quite frankly a paradise compared to what other people were going through. You know, we saw massive numbers of cancellations. The stories about people not being able to access a contact center were just terrible. And it begs the question, Steph, as we go right into our course of the interview today, from a CX perspective, in your opinion, are we at the lowest point in terms of consumer confidence in the willingness of airlines to support their customers?
I think we're probably, if I look at it across industries, we're probably at the lowest consumer confidence level across many industries, because I think people have a little amnesia as well of moving from some of these massive businesses and structures or organizations where, you know, everyone's just still recovering from making massive, you know, changes following the pandemic, right? Especially the airline industry, where, you know, they had to quickly and swiftly move to, you know, completely almost decimate their business, right? So it's easy to forget how dramatically airlines had to reduce that capacity to like weather the early part of the pandemic, and then ramp an operation like that back up isn't any small feat. So I think some of the downfall is a result of that complexity. The other thing, I think, with any business right now, the quiet quitting, which is not just people leaving their jobs, but doing the bare minimum, I think is also a big factor, because I think across any industry right now, from a customer experience perspective, it hits the customer differently. And I can't tell you the amount of experiences I've had, whether it's my furnace repairman to, you know, airlines and whatnot, where I feel like it's now a part-time job for me to do someone else's job. And so I think from the airline industry specifically, there's massive challenges. But I think that, you know, I look at it and say, you know, the short-term reputational impact versus long-term demand, people fly on the airlines not because they want to fly them, but because they need to get somewhere, right? So when I was in North Dakota, I flew United because those had the best flight paths for me on where I needed to go, right? I was going to the Philippines a lot, Chicago to Manila, you know, I could get there pretty quickly through Hong Kong, where when I moved to Minneapolis, I switched to Delta, right? And so it stinks because you have all those loyalty points and you have status, and you travel very differently when you have a status versus when you don't. But I think, you know, in general, there's, I think, some massive differences too in some of the operating models from some of the airlines versus others, where the demographics and customer makeup looks different as well. So there's sometimes different expectations. But overall, I think people are frustrated now with the looming potential recession in the United States specifically, that when they spend their money, they want to be taken care of. And I think I'm never a big fan of saying get rid of humans to solve problems, because if you have the best tech in place, the best self-service, that's great to handle a lot of the tier one. But when you get to some of these complex issues, you better hope that you also have people who can help solve some of those challenges as well.
And I think that you're touching on something. When people get on an airline or when they get on a plane, they're deciding that they need to get somewhere. But there's also a loyalty factor in this whole element. And you referenced your points, whether it's on United, Delta. I'm a big Air Canada user. And there's almost a sense that if you're going to be driving loyalty, if loyalty is going to be part of that equation where you're going to keep people coming back, definitely geography and what hub you're in has something to do with it. But it's also how you're treated. And the sense I got from going through various airports over the course of the Christmas break was that people were angry. They were frustrated. It didn't matter what airline they were dealing with. They couldn't get answers. They couldn't really engage with anybody who was going to be able to facilitate them. Some people I heard were getting vouchers for $10 after having spent 24 hours in an airport, and they were told, yeah, this is what you can use to go buy a coffee and a sandwich. So my question to you is, have the airlines given up on delivering high levels of customer experience? Have they given up on delivering high levels of service? Is this just something that might be something storied in the past that we'll never come back to again?
I think I'll never see the old school travel where, you see everyone in suits and traveling is like a luxury day, right? It was something where people were excited and it was prestigious, and you had to be almost of a certain class to be able to fly. I think I'll never see that, right? I think now, especially with COVID, it's rare to wear jeans. Like, people are wearing athleisure and wearing their joggers and whatnot, especially when they're traveling. In comparison, you still see people in some suits, but I think overall the service level, I do think with the looming costs and the changes in operational structures and how they're really focused on the profit margins, I think that the customers from an airline perspective have almost become a complete cost center instead of a value center. And I think it does change dramatically in how you look at traveling. For me, you're right, I'm loyal to an airline and I will travel them and try to have the limited amount of connections as possible. But overall, like, if a flight's going to be half the cost, even though I'm a Delta, Diamond Medallion, Million Miler, whatever, I'm still going to potentially, if I have to get somewhere faster for half the cost, I'll probably choose something else, even though I know I won't be treated as well. Because I'll tell you, even flying some of my airlines I fly, if I'm not in first class, in which I will get upgraded quite frequently based on status, if I'm not, sometimes I'm treated very differently just because I'm in a section of the plane. So it's interesting to see, even from a loyalty perspective, how you're treated if you're stuck somewhere at an airport versus in the front of the plane versus the back of the plane. I think it's a different experience for everyone across the board. And especially the more frequent travelers who are a little bit more savvy and knowing how to get through or what to ask for or what their options are when things happen. I got stuck, and when I missed my connection coming back from Mexico, Delta was very good about giving me QR codes to have my hotel, to get my food and everything like that. But the lady behind me had no idea. And unless she asked for that, they wouldn't have just given it to her, right? So I think it's also kind of knowing that. But you're right. I think overall, I think you have people who are very frustrated and very angry in general, but then you put them all at an airport, and instead of it being something that used to be a fun experience, it's become a dreaded experience. And part of that, I think, is how people feel when they're traveling based on how they're treated.
Yeah, and when you talk about the difference in treatment between the front of the plane and the back of the plane, that epic Seinfeld episode comes to mind where Jerry was put up front, Elaine was stuck in economy, and two very different experiences. And I know that was in the early 90s, but I think we could all probably relate to that here in going into 2023. So you referenced something earlier, Steph, that I think really is important, and that is the whole element of the Great Resignation and quiet quitting. So in your opinion, what role does employee experience factor into customer management for airlines? And I ask this giving some context here. One of the airports I went through over the course of my travels during Christmas, I was chatting with one of the frontline agents at the check-in desks, and they were telling me on Christmas Eve, they had up to a dozen people just walk off the job because they didn't feel that they were able to do their jobs properly. They didn't feel they had the requisite training. They had angry customers, IT systems that, quite frankly, weren't user-friendly as agents. So where does this whole EX factor sit into airline CX in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big proponent of if you have happy employees, you're going to have happy customers, even in those tough situations, because people know, and I think at the end of the day, we're all human, and you're going to have people who will fly off the handle and be a little bit more on, the very angry side. But for the most part, I think as long as there's clear communication, more transparency and directness, and all served with some empathy, I think it can change people's opinions or frustrations a lot faster, right? And so we've all been in the situations where I know something's happening, your flight keeps getting delayed, you're like, okay, this is the fourth time it's been delayed, you know what's going on. And when I can go online on my app and look at where my flight is before, and I'm not getting the updated information to know that flight hasn't even left the other airport yet to get to mine, and you're being fed something different or different information, it gets frustrating, right? And it's probably frustrating too for the gate agent who's trying to give that updated information to you, who maybe doesn't have the details in their systems. And so I think that there's a lot of layers of complexity, but the more airlines, airports, all the staff can be armed with updated technology that makes their job easier to then be able to handle the human emotion on top of it, makes all the difference, right? Because that one customer, that is their one experience that, potentially ever, maybe that day, maybe that year, and being able to be treated like a human with some empathy, I think goes a long way. But when you have employees who don't feel like they have the tools to be able to do the job, or they're one of 5 roles and those 4 other roles aren't filled, or people are sick or aren't coming to work, it makes it a lot more stressful. So, I think looking at last year, Cirium released a study where they said the biggest 3 issues that impacted the flights that they watched, it was about 5 million last year between January 1st and December 15th. So they released their report prior to a lot of the debacles, but the number 1 issue was staffing shortages, 2 was air traffic control, and then 3 was severe weather. So when you have the staffing as one of the biggest issues, especially when, a lot of these companies had to lay off, tens of thousands of people when COVID happened and then had to ramp that back up, that's no short feat, right? Mm-hmm. So I think people have to be a little bit more understanding. At the same time, the companies need to make sure that, there are tools in place. I mean, Southwest, there was, I think, 17,000 flights were canceled as an example.
Oh, yeah.
But, 2021, June and October, they had massive issues because of technology, right? So it's making sure you have as much in place as possible. We all know things are going to happen. Like, it's not easy streets. And looking into 23 and 24, they're still calling it the Flightmare. I always love these, new sensationalized names they come up with.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Arctic plunge, polar blast, whatever the new weather things are that we just said were cold when we lived in North Dakota. But, the Flightmare that they have named, kind of the whole operation, everything happening in the industry, they're expecting to go into 2024, right? Because with 2023 coming up, or are already in it, I guess, we're already worried about, Euro control. So if we even go outside of the United States, they're calling it the most challenging year of the last decade for this year, just because there's, summer delays, the aerospace issues with Ukraine, the extra aircraft that people have been buying in the air, possible industrial actions that are happening across some countries, system changes, and then, we have the progressive opening now of Asian markets. So I think we're going to continue to see challenges, but it's a matter of how many of these airlines can put, in the airports, can put the customer first as a value versus a cost. And I think those that can do that will remain, will keep that loyal base versus some people kind of jumping to other airlines who will maintain that a little bit more.
Okay, so final question for our discussion today. Your an advisor when it comes to customer experience management, what counsel would you give an airline that's looking to try and beef up their CX functions going into 2023? Where would you recommend they start, and what should be the end game for them in terms of making improvements or modifications or ameliorations?
Yeah, so I always like to go back to the basics, right? I like to go back to the root cause of, okay, why are your customers upset or calling or texting, tweeting, whatever it is in the first place? And if we know that there's the main big three that are going to continue to happen, like the staffing, weather, we can't always predict it, but we can look at trends over time and understand, like, what are some of the things we could put in place? What's already broken? Is it technology? Is it staffing? How do we fix that? Are there some creative models that we could look at to have some peak assistance, whether it's the gig workplace, whether it's automation, whatever that is, really depends on the culture of those customers too. But I think at the end of the day, we quickly forget that customers are the reason why most businesses, products, services exist. So it's understanding what those big gaps are. I'd say what I've seen overall is understanding and figuring out from a technology standpoint, like, what can you put in that's the most frictionless self-service option as possible. So when some of those issues happen, you're not bogged down with every single customer that you're impacting. And then that's also for airline staff and airport staff, right? Making sure all of that's in place. Then from a human perspective, making sure that people have solid training programs, that the people that you have on staff understand, what is happening. There's clear communication across, and making sure that they also understand that they're leading with a side of empathy. But I think for me, I look at how can you add or subset some of that workload balance. And for me, it's making sure that whether you're in-house or you outsource to companies, that model is really strong, and you have some solid plan A, B's, and C's. So when things happen, you can quickly pull the trigger. There are companies out there who I've worked with where we're supporting emergency situations where you can have staff who's jumping on and at least handling some of those tier 1 challenges or the conversations. I think there's a variety of models to look at, but it's understanding, like, what would work for the business based on current gaps, and then looking at what would we need in place if there is going to be other issues that we know kind of are the same thing year over year, and how do we prepare for that?
Awesome. Well, look, Stephanie, Todd, founder and CEO of Soul CX, thank you. This has been a very timely and a very insightful discussion. We look forward to having you back soon on the CX Files, but in the meantime, have a great rest of the year.
Thank you so much. You too.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.